few of us today, so might be a little shorter class than usual. Hopefully everybody got a chance to read the text. Text was Kenneth Kraft's Nuclear Ecology and Engaged Buddhism, which is on page 393. A couple things I guess maybe we could talk about. He broke this book into I would say probably 3 parts. The first part was just kind of a Buddhist response to nuclear issues, and so in here I think it's interesting. Did it have a date of when he wrote this text? Because it seems a little dated. Maybe back in the 90s, late 90s maybe.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I think it's the late 90s is when he was when he wrote this.
Yeah, so it's a little dated, but I think at the same time a lot of what he talks about still applies. Like, I don't feel like hardly anything's, especially with, like, I think if anything the nuclear issue has probably gone out of favor as far as like a hot button topic, like it used to be. And so in here he talked about just some of the actions that were done. So he had talked about this what was it, the group Joanna Macy had created this concept of nuclear guardianship, where it was rather than shrink, and this is on 394, rather than shrink in dread from nuclear waste, she argues we must take responsibility for it. Macy cultivates an awareness of future beings, imagining that one of their urgent questions to us might be, what have you done or not done to safeguard us from the toxic nuclear waste you bequeathed us? And so she actually had the Nuclear Guardianship Project, which only lasted for about 4 years, 91 to 94. Then there were a couple of other, like the Green Gulch Zen Center of San Francisco were pretty active. It says kind of at the bottom, staged an evocative multimedia ceremony and performance to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they, even to the point where they kind of added an extra vow to the 4 vows of a Bodhisattva that the Zen tradition uses. And then in the 94, on 395, it talks about Buddhists coming together to commemorate the Buddha's birthday at the Nevada nuclear test site and kind of doing some actions there. So it's interesting to look at these kind of methods that people had done or actions that people had done in the past, because I think especially for many of us who want to be more engaged, I don't know, I really read a lot of, I don't want to say like lessons from frustration, but later in the text where he was talking about just the challenges to Buddhist environmentalism, he talked about how there was kind of like three groups of people that kind of came out of that. Let's see where I can find where she said that. Where was that? Really towards the end. Well, no, I can't find it. That's why I should have highlighted. But basically you had like 3 groups that, one group really questioned the effectiveness of doing like ceremonies and rituals in regards to, if something is big and it all, as massive as nuclear waste, doing the prostrations, then the chanting, what effect does it have? And so they had the small, the third that were like, how does this work? What does it do? Then you had the second group that was kind of in the middle that said, kind of question the effectiveness, but recognize the ceremony. And then the others that recognize the power in the ceremony itself, whether the immediate action was beneficial or not. The action itself. Oh, page 403. Thank you, Andrea.
Yep, at the top.
Yeah. It says, in the face of real environmental threats, in this case, the hazards posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear waste, what's the significance of symbolic ritual activities? And if rituals are among the appropriate response, what relevance do traditional ritual forms have in contemporary context? And so it says, several of the participants in the test site ceremony wonder aloud at the vows, prostrations, and other gestures have real impact on the terrible dangers they seek to address. For some, the discrepancies of scale seemed unsurmountable. For others, ritual addressing nuclear concerns would have better claim to relevance in a society that handled nuclear matters responsible. And then a third group recognized the severity of our nuclear plight, yet reaffirmed the efficiency of ritual ceremonial acts, even if such behavior appears futile to skeptics. So, yeah, I mean, it's, and I think what he talks about here, especially with those actions at the beginning of the text, I think those are, that type of those questions, I think, are just as valid today. Whether we want to talk about environmentalism, whether we want to talk about other social justice issues such as the prison system or systematic inequality throughout our society. When people want to approach something through like prayer ceremonies or other rituals, that question comes up, and I think it's a valid question. And the reason why I think it's a valid question, at least for me, is because it really does make you think about karma, cause and effect, which the middle part of the text he talked about. This notion of kind of a traditional view of karma, like, oh, that poor person, you could use karma to justify social injustice, saying, well, that was just their karma, whereas a more what I read in his book is a more modern explanation is that's a person's karma shouldn't be used as a label or a holder of value for that person. Really, it's about, here's the causes and conditions that brought me to this point in time. The lesson of karma, especially in the view, through the lens of social justice, is what actions can I do? What seeds can I plant now that will then down the road cause causes and conditions to arise for a different outcome? And so when we think about ritual, a lot of times when you see people doing actions, I would even argue when people are doing actions like a protest where they sit down and they lock their arms, or they do actions that cause them to be arrested, those are rituals that are now kind of in a modern understanding, like you do these certain things to get an outcome. And I think a lot of times if you look at that and say, well, oh, you all got arrested, what did that do? The problem is still there. That's the same type of the questioning that we could look at. And then we have to look at our own selves and say, if we look at just the seed being planted, you may say, oh, well, that's never going to have an effect on the problem at hand. But what I think you fail to see is the potential of that seed, that if the causes and conditions are there, so plant the seed and then start to work for the conditions to be present for that to arise, whatever that is.
I think one of the great examples that they give in the book of that idea of ritual and protest taking place is somewhere in there early on, I think it's that last protest group was doing the walking meditation, and then they would purposely continue the walk across the line and
Yep.
get arrested, And so in many ways, they're not just planting their own karmic seeds, but like you were talking about, planting karmic seeds for change to take place,
Well, and I look at like the 50s with, the civil rights movement, about how, Rosa Parks on the bus didn't think long, like, oh, by, not giving up my seat, I'm going to, cause, the civil rights movement to really be kind of thrust into the media. Yet her action, as small as it was, produced a result, and we see that time and time again. I would say even, the one that's most recent in my mind is Standing Rock, right? Standing Rock, where people were protesting about how much it galvanized, that thinking, and that something that wasn't on someone's radar, of like, oh, most people don't think about, oh, a pipeline going through land, but then all of a sudden, all this awareness was raised, and during those protests, there was a lot of there were a lot of ceremonies being done. There was a lot of, ceremonies all throughout the world being done, in kind of solidarity. So yeah,
I'm reading this really interesting, or I'm actually listening to this really interesting book called Amity and Prosperity, and it's about the fracking movement in Pennsylvania. And the woman that the book centers around becomes an activist against the fracking industry and sort of divides her community. But she just started out trying to get her kids well because they were getting sick from the mercury that was showing up in their water system. And she didn't really start out to change this entire community and get the fracking industry kicked out of their valley. She was just trying to get her kids well, know.
Yeah, so I'm curious, for the rest of you, what are your thoughts around ritual, around kind of a more traditional Buddhist response to a modern problem?
So this reminded me of when Luis gave the talk about the Thai monks wrapping and ordaining the trees. I think it's fantastic. I think we do what we can do, and I fully believe in the ripple effects of these things. Whether it's Lama Lina offering making offerings to the land spirits, or a more rituals like this at certain nuclear sites. Like, I think this guy wrote about it, and we're reading about it, 15 years later. So there's a ripple effect. I think there's room for it in addition to other practical actions.
Nice.
Well, I am reminded of Greta Thunberg, 16-year-old autistic kid, and had the conviction, and I kind of envy her that not only did she have the conviction, but she had the wherewithal to go and do it, which puts me to shame, really. But sometimes when I'm in the Philippines and I walk on the beach, and and you get all these debris from everywhere, it's really a sad thing. And Luis is, sad that water temperature is going up. I mean, it's like it's really warm in the Pacific, and and we have coral down there, and it's not gonna be there for very long because of the warming effect. And so, the morning walks can be rituals, just giving merit to healing the ocean. Um, I think if we just get in the habit of intending our actions, imagination and intention, I think are important.
There's an author I like to listen to, a kind of a comedic, well, I don't know what you would call it, but David Sedaris. You've heard all, he's on like NPR and stuff like that. And I was reading, or actually I was listening to one of his books on tape, and he had talked about when he and his husband lived in England. He, on his walks, he would actually pick up the trash as he would walk, and he talked about how he kind of got a little OCD about it. So it almost became like a job for him, and very comedic story. But one of the things that kind of I was like, oh wow, that's cool, was he kind of talked about how you could tell where he would stop, because his little area was spotless with trash, yet you go just over that next little hill and then it's kind of littered quite a so here he was doing something just to occupy his time and fulfill his OCD-ness, I guess. Yet at the same time, he was causing a lot of benefit from these small actions, so having these small actions, I think sometimes people do feel very overwhelmed. What can I do? It's how could I ever go up against, big corporations and stuff like that? Yeah, it's the small actions that really are the ones that we can do, for our neighborhoods and our communities. And I think that's one of the things that Buddhism kind of points to, is this notion of, oh, if you really truly want to help all sentient beings, because I think sometimes, and he talks about it in this essay, this notion of this absurd like Bodhisattva vow, may I liberate all beings, and he talked about it, sentient beings are numberless, I'll do the best I can to save them. Desire is inexhaustible, I will do the best I can to put them to end. Dharma is boundless, I will do the best I can to master them. This notion of, trying to help all sentient beings, even in our own tradition, this Bodhisattva vow, I'm going to benefit all, I'm going to work for the benefit of all sentient beings, and we think like, oh, I could never, stop nuclear waste or whatever environmental issue is near and dear to your heart. Yet here you're making this vow that you're going to benefit all sentient beings, not just humans, but all life, all things that are sentient. And I think sometimes when we as bodhisattvas think about that, we take the vow with an aspiration, and then we can get really discouraged. And I think the training really does help, where you do start with yourself and your own issues and woundedness, and you just begin to radiate that, kind of like with the Tonglen meditation, where you start with yourself. There's a couple ways. You could either start with those that you are near and dear, loved ones, and radiate that to neutral people, then people who are negative. Or you could even do it geographically, where you start with yourself, you start with your house, you start with your neighborhood, and you just kind of bring that out. And I think that's probably a good method for doing a lot of these, or doing actions or methods, skillful methods for environmentalism. I don't know. Anybody else
Did
have any thoughts? Yeah.
did anybody happen to hear about what was taking place in Punjab in India over the past couple of days? So, because it's sort of interesting because it's because of the lockdown, people in the region of Punjab are able to see the Himalayas.
Oh yeah, I did see that.
For the first time in like 30 years, they're actually able to see the mountain range. And it's all because of the fact that these factories can't be working right now. And I wonder, like, I'm sort of interested to see how these, what we would think of as kind of negative karmic seeds of this disease are placed, but then there's this like great benefit. And so what are people going to do now? Like, they're overwhelmed by the fact that, look, there's the mountain range we haven't seen forever. How can we actually move forward and keep that view for ourselves? You know, it'll be kind of interesting to see. Or do they go back to just polluting the skies once again? You know, I don't know. I think it might be kind of interesting to see.
Yeah. What was it? NASA or whatever, one of the space agencies, showed the pollution over Italy, I think, when they went into lockdown. How it
Yeah.
cleared up.
China is this, they showed China as well, and it's
Oh
like
yeah.
just unbelievable.
Yeah. Glenn, did you have something? I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I think that really it becomes a matter of if you look at the vow that you're going to do this for all sentient beings, if at that time you plan the outcome of what you're going to do, then you set up an expectation of yourself. And I think at that point, why you've really destroyed what the vow is really about in terms of that everything that I do is going to be for the benefit. And then in the larger sense of what's happening now with the plague, if you will, the plague is really what's causing the large change within the climate warming and within the way society is benefiting from that. But at the same time, historically, if I take a look at the bubonic plague, there was a great upheaval after that in terms of the rich who were in control of the serfs, and there was a change in society, but ultimately that change went back to the rich and well-to-do controlling what was going to happen in society. And it's a recurring historical matter with the way civilization tends to work. So consequently, I think that the lesson that has to be learned is for the individual to try to make the difference and to make as much of a difference as we can. The big thing that we see right now that really puts the entitled powers that control government and control society in danger is that the serfs who are making $8 an hour are now breaking down that society because the political environment depends upon them. So consequently, you end up with an upheaval that then in return, as people rise up, and it starts the whole cycle over again. I guess I'm really rather pessimistic about making large change because I see that change comes slowly and really truly is a ripple effect, not something that happens because of the one thing that I do.
But that's part of the ripple effect. I mean, that's the definition of a ripple effect.
Exactly. So we have to act independently and create that ripple as much as we can. But then you have the great catastrophe that really turns things over, that makes a huge difference. But then you start all over in the cycle again because of the way humanity tends to work. Does that make any sense at all? Or am I just wandering in the wilderness?
Yeah, I mean, I understand definitely where you're coming from. You know, I also think that a lot of times the larger effects, you know, again, as Buddhists, when I think this is where the challenge comes with the teachings, because again, the every when I read different texts, it seems like every generation reads those texts and applies them to their situation as best as possible. And that's why I think it's interesting in this book, because he takes one example of like just the traditional understanding kind of karma that is presented traditionally. This almost like, I don't want to say fatalism, but this notion of, oh, that's just your karma. You know, oh, that person that only makes $8 an hour, that's just their karma, and says, well, no, that interpretation has to be, or the understanding of karma has to be understood or useful in the contemporary field, or, you know, in our life and here and today. And I would say, especially with like social justice and other things like that, that's you know, to look at karma differently, not saying like, oh, we're going to, you know, make up rules of how karma works differently. It's just a different way of understanding the intricacies of karma, I think can really be helpful, you know, planting the seed. Yeah, Nicole, go ahead.
Well, I think that, you know, one of the most interesting readings to me today are the ones that are looking at the idea of intersectionality and Buddhism and Buddhist thought, you know, especially people like Lama Rod, who are bringing this kind of interesting Black queerness to the text, right? And looking at that and saying, wait a second, like, is it my karma that I'm dealing with? The fact that I get pulled over because I'm a Black man, you know, all of those questions that come with just being who you are in a society changes, I think, how you look at karma, you know, interdependent co-arising and stuff like that. You know, all of this stuff is so different when you have so many different like lenses looking at the text, you know.
Well, and I would say, you know, and that's what's so nice about having the varied voices, because, you know, even a term like liberation, you know, for a white male means something completely different than liberation for folks who are in the Black community. You know, that word carries different weight, and, you know, I I have an appreciation when that weight is shared, so that when, you know, it gives that the term like, oh, I'm going to liberate all beings, you know, all of a sudden it gives it a deeper, richer understanding, that you normally wouldn't have. And so having those voices, I think, is good. And again, that's somebody just planting that seed. So
That's a great, like, that's a really great perspective and point that you bring up, you know, just about that one word, you know. Which, I mean, you know, I think we can look at that through a lot of, I would be interested to see how other indigenous people are looking at Buddhist texts, you know, not just African Americans, but like, are there folks in Latin America looking at Buddhism? You know?
well, yeah, there's Brazil and Chile, and
Yeah, like, yeah, there's a lot of Dharma teachers that go down there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would be interested to hear that perspective, you know,
Do you speak Spanish?
a little bit. Un poquito.
I have a Dharma brother / Facebook friend who's kind of a spiritual leader down there that I'd be happy to put you in touch with. That would probably give you a good insight into that. But
I would love that. I would really be fascinated by that, actually.
But you know what's really interesting is when you kind of open up and allow other ways of, again, not necessarily interpreting, but just revealing deeper meanings. Because again, you mentioned the queer community, you know, the LGBTQ community. A notion of liberation has something completely different. Like for a trans person, liberation is different. You know, even for women, you know, liberation is different. You know, and I think in a lot of, and this is kind of the debate that goes out, you know, going on right now in the Buddhist community is, you know, the lens of understanding, we get it from, you know, a very, you know, masculine point of view, because it comes from the monks and the teachers who usually were taking those more traditional teaching roles. I was listening to Lama Lena this weekend, where she was, you know, in her Dharma teaching, she was talking about, you really have to, because there was a question about like integrating different aspects of teachings. And she's like, you got to be very careful, because if, you know, there's certain teachings out there that are primarily, the audience is young monastics, you know, so these particular teachings are aimed for, you know, men who are monastics, who are in their teenage years and are full of hormones and other things. And, you know, but they were all trained a certain way. So when they teach that training way. And all of a sudden now they're teaching, you know, lay people, not monastics. They're teaching, you know, not only just men, but women. And so all of a sudden this teaching that was very relevant to them at their specific time is misapplied, and then all of a sudden it can cause people, it could actually cause harm to people if misunderstood. And so that's why I think this text is really interesting, because it kind of points to that notion of, you know, understanding the teachings in a deeper way, so that you know how they're applied. Again, like karma, sitting there saying, oh, that's your karma. I mean, that's a terrible thing to try to, you know, to get, you know, say that's the reason why somebody is the way they are. I mean, it's not helpful. And I would say it's not skillful. So I don't know.
Well, it's not skillful to point out what you think is someone else's karma, because you really don't know what their karma is.
Well,
So
that's true. Yeah.
there's a transgression there that occurs, that you're not looking at yourself. You're trying to put blame on to something other than yourself.
Yeah. Well, and that's why for me, karma isn't about past actions. It's about your present actions creating, you know, those ripples, those causes and conditions.
And that's where I was going. That, you know, it all occurs in the present. So you can't look to the future. Whatever the ripple does is what's going to happen. So you can't make a plan for that end product of the protest or whatever it is.
Well, yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. That notion of like, oh, we're going to protest, and we're, you know, from this protest, we're going to expect a result. And I would say, Glenn, that's actually a great point, because, you know, when we talk about those thirds, you know, the people that are saying, oh, this isn't doing anything, are they expecting that one action to cause an immediate result? Versus those who say, oh, ritual has its place or ceremonies have its place, are they looking at that action differently, in accordance with result?
Well, yeah, shouldn't we be getting out of the results business altogether and just saying we're doing good action at this point, you know? I often like, so this is sort of brings up a notion like, so we're standing back and we see something happen to someone and we say, well, that's their karma. But isn't it really our responsibility as bodhisattvas to go assist when we see injustices taking place, rather than just, you know, acknowledging their karma or whatever, you know, like that's not even our job really, you know?
Well, I would, yeah, and one of the things though I would just caution against, like, we shouldn't be interested in result, because without understanding of result, we wouldn't understand what's positive and negative action. Positive and negative is due to the result that's occurring. So, and again, it's only when we're talking about karma, we're also talking about karma in a very large, you know, there's many different things. It's not just about the result, you know, it's also about intentionality. It's also about, you know, engaging through skillful means. So yeah, I would definitely agree that, you know, if you see someone, you know, like in the book, they talk about, you hear a sound of a car crash, you're going to get up and go out and help. And one of the things they mentioned was that's your dharma. That's your actions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just about sitting on a cushion. It's about helping when you can. Yet at the same time, you know, helping somebody in an auto accident, if you are a medically trained professional, you're probably going to have more skill to truly be able to benefit that person than if you were just a lay person. You know, so as a lay person, running out there and trying to pull someone out of a car may not be the skillful action. The skillful action would be calling the ambulance. I mean, that's when we're talking about actions, that's where we really need to get into kind of skillfulness. So understanding that I'm going to do an action, like if I can't do anything, like if I can't make an immediate do an action for something on the other side of the world, you know, that can cause me to feel helpless and powerless. Or I could get on my cushion and do ritual practices like Tonglen or metta meditation, or maybe even doing like a green Tara or a medicine Buddha, or some practice with the intention of benefiting beings, with those beings maybe in my mind. But at the same time, that's also, that intention is being put out there. There may not be you know, I may not expect a result saying, you know, you know, if they aren't cured tomorrow, then I'm giving up my practice. That would not be the right way of looking at it. But you could also say, well, the result is me putting out positive intention, me using this practice to work on my own mind, so that when I am afflicted with my own illness or whatever, then I can, you know, be in maybe a better mental state. Who knows? But it's an interesting question that they raise in this essay.
Wouldn't the practice really within oneself prepare you to have right intention and to actually take action one way or another, because your mental condition has prepared you for that, rather than doing harm because of a wrong intention.
Yeah, it's definitely habituating yourself to doing positive actions.
Right.
As we've been talking about this, it just makes me think of the Eightfold Path, right? That, you know, this is sort of the way I'm going. These are the things I'm doing in all of these aspects, so that when situations arise, I'm just preconditioned to put out a hand to help someone up or call the ambulance, you know, because this is the path I've chosen to take, and I've done the work along the way.
Yeah, and you know, when you read about actions of like the Buddha, you know, why did the Buddha teach? He taught because sentient beings were in need. He wasn't teaching out of his own arrogance or to make people think he was, you know, some holy person. He saw the suffering of beings and was just spontaneously that welling up of compassion, you know, caused him to then teach. You know, at the very beginning, he really had to kind of be almost spurred on, right? So he at the very beginning, he gained enlightenment. He realized this was so profound that he couldn't teach. And then, you know, Indra and the gods had to say, no, what you've discovered will truly benefit beings. And so a lot of times they say the Buddhas act because of the needs of sentient beings. The other thing that, and kind of gets to, I think, what I understood you, Glenn, was saying is kind of this aspect of result of not and like expecting a result is, you know, you can have all the intentions that you want, but all of it, you know, if you're expecting an action to happen and it doesn't happen, then you can get discouraged and you can get you can have a lot of doubt come up. Am I really making a difference? And then that can actually cause inaction or even regret.
That's because you're not living in the moment then. The present is the only focus that we really should have. Because if the future has changed from what I expected it to be, it is what it is, and you must accept that and move on. And if at that point, with good intention, you can try again, then you're in a good position. Once again, that's just what I'm trying to say. That never expect the outcome, because you'll be disappointed by it.
Yeah, you know, Buddhism, you know, again, when we're talking about like traditional teachings, I think the teaching of the emptiness of the three spheres is very helpful in what you're saying, Glenn, because, you know, this is the emptiness of the self, the emptiness of the other, but also the emptiness of the action itself. You plant the seed, and then, you know, the intention's there, the hope, you know, with the skillful means is that you've put cause and condition that seed will ripen in a positive way. But if it doesn't ripen, you know, that's the emptiness of the action, you know. So
There's a story that I read a long time ago that it stayed with me for a while. But it's a story of this man who was in a car accident. And so he's talking about his near-death experience. And he was saying that in the accident, there were all these people that were helping him. And but his focus went on to some woman somewhere, you know, I mean, all the cars were stopped. And this woman was praying and praying for him, and nobody else had thought about it. But he heard the prayer, and it helped him to come back to life. So, you know, we can never really underestimate the power of our intention.
yeah.
And the woman was just praying for him, you know, didn't have any ulterior motive. But in his recollection of what happened, he was thankful to, you know, all the first responders and the people that helped him. But that one woman or that voice that was praying for him stood out in his memory. So
Yeah, excellent.
I think that really points out what your real intention is, because if what it is that you're doing it because you rushing to help the person in the car, and I'll be there and people will see me. It's not the correct intention, because your focus is on yourself at that point. And the woman praying was her focus was on the person in the accident, quietly.
To me, that's like the power of Tonglen, you know, doing that practice, like is for that moment of when we see the accident, we just go into alleviating the suffering of others, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you know, and I think I've mentioned this before. One time I was talking with my teacher because I was just feeling a little discouraged, you know, with just some efforts I had been trying to put into place. And, you know, he just said to me, all you can do is plant a seed. Hope that, you know, try to provide the causes and conditions for that seed to ripen. If it doesn't ripen, you've at least planted a seed, you know. And I was like, yeah. And I think just looking back on my own practice, there were a lot of teachers in the early years that planted a seed because I had no idea what they're talking about. But, you know, I'm grateful for those connections, you know, 20 something years later, you know, however brief that was. So.
But, you know, I've always liked the analogy of the seed, right? This idea of, you know, sometimes we plant seeds and we get the tomato plants this summer and we get to enjoy the fruits of that right now. But there's also ones that we plant that cause trees to grow, and 30 years from now we'll have apples that we will never see, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
You know, it's not about us eating apples, it's about some kid down the road, you know. I've always loved that Johnny Appleseed story because of that, you know.
Yeah, you know, and that's why when I see people making masks, you know, I think that's great. You know, there's this whole debate about whether you know, these homemade masks are truly effective or not, and it's like, you know, it's something, you know, it's better than nothing, you know, and the people who are making the masks, their minds are in the right place, you know, so where's the harm in it, you know, as long as you're not, you know, giving false hope. And I think most people who make the masks understand that it's not the best, but it's something, you know, and that's all you can do. Yeah. All right. Just want to hold some space for any other questions, comments, emotional expressions. Glenn's got his mask. You know, I thought you were wearing a ninja mask for a second there, Glenn, because you had your black shirt and your black mask. And I was like, man, you're taking up a new hobby. That's good to see.
I couldn't make out who it was at first. I was like, who is that masked man?
Okay, so next week we are, the text is Deep Ecology and Political Activism, which I don't know what page that is.
Can you remind me, do we have 2 more Wednesdays or 1 more Wednesday?
Yeah, so technically 2. So the last Wednesday was originally supposed to be the Bodhisattva vows.
Oh, okay.
So instead, what I might do is use the last Wednesday to talk about just a class on the Bodhisattva vows themselves. So for those folks who have taken Bodhisattva vows before, you know, kind of get a refresher, and then those who haven't taken them and want to take them can take them if they want. So who knows?
Hey, are you going to send out some emails about that? I bet that might bring in a lot more people that have kind of drifted off.
Yeah. Cool. I can definitely do that.
Are we talking about the 23rd?
22nd, I think.
22nd, Earth Day.
Oh no, that was when we were doing Wednesdays. So you're right, the 20th.
Oh yeah, see, I'm grateful for Glenn. Deep Ecology and Political Activism is on page 379 on the book, by the way. So, okay, so again, it was nice seeing everybody. We will meet up next Thursday, and so that should be the last reading out of the book. But let's do our precept dedication prayer.